let folks file in throughout?
Yes, I think we should
Okay.
get started.
All right, sounds good. I will just start with thanking everyone for being here and joining us today. We're really excited to be in this Zoom room or Zoom webinar with you today. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And as an uninvited guest on these lands, I feel deep appreciation to those who have stewarded and continue to steward these lands. So I invite you to take some time now to think about the territories you're joining from as well. And if you would like to acknowledge the territory you're joining from and tell us who you are, you're welcome to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And we'll explain a little bit more about that function in a couple of seconds here. So welcome and thank you again for joining. Today's event is Hate Speech in BC, and we're going to be learning about laws on hate speech. I did want to tell you that we do have closed captioning available for today's session. So if you would like to turn that on, there is a closed captioning button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you can click that button and then there should be a second option that pops up that says show subtitles, and then you should be able to read along with the captions. So maybe let's start with introductions. I'm really excited to be joined here by Camilia and Sarah, my colleagues here at BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. So maybe we can just each introduce ourselves and who we are. So I will start and then pass it to you, Sarah, and then over to Camilia. So my name is Emily Chan. I'm one of the engagement advisors here at the office. When planning today's session, I've been thinking a lot about how identity overlaps with things like human rights, and specifically hate speech, as that's what we're talking about specifically today. So when I think about identity, I specifically, of all the identities that I hold, specifically thinking about my mixed race identity, specifically Chinese and white mixed race. And in my life, my somewhat complicated relationship with being mixed race really frames how I understand and experience human rights. So that's a bit about me. Really excited to be in this space with you. I will pass it to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Emily. My name is Sarah Khan, and I'm General Counsel with the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm joining today from the unceded territories of the Squamish and Lillooet peoples. I also, similar to Emily, want to acknowledge that I'm of mixed race. I also have mixed religious backgrounds, and I'm the child of parents who immigrated to Canada. And all of those things have made me, of course, have an interest in things related to hate speech. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share some of the things that we've developed with you today, and to hear from you as well about. There will be some different interactive portions of this session, so really looking forward to that. Also just wanted to say that I have low vision, so you might see me periodically looking a little closer at my screen, and just wanted to let you know that's the reason why. And back over to you, Camilia.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you both. Hi, everyone. My name is Camilia Butti. I am an engagement advisor here at the office, so similar position to Emily. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh, from where I'm a very, very grateful visitor. My family is from Salo, Punjab, so I'm an immigrant, and I'm also a settler. So both of those identities have influenced how I navigate through the world in general, but also how I've navigated and interacted with hate speech and human rights. So I'm coming today to this conversation with both of those lenses, and really looking forward to this talk and to present this content. So thank you all. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you both. And thanks to everyone who's introducing themselves in the Q&A here. I see that there is a lot of class joining us. So welcome to all of you. That's so exciting. Thanks for being here. And folks joining from all over the province. So thanks for being here. And continue to introduce yourselves in the Q&A if you'd like to. At this point, I will pass it back to you, Camilia, to give a little bit of introduction to our office.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. So BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, or the office, as you'll hear us say throughout this presentation, was reinstated in 2019, and that was after 17 years without a commission in BC. BC's Human Rights Commissioner, Kasari Govinder, started her 5-year term in September of 2019, so she's about halfway through her term. Our office exists to address the root causes of inequality, discrimination, and injustice in our province. And we do this work through shifting laws, policies, practices, and cultures. And we do this work through a few different avenues, including through research, advocacy, inquiry, monitoring, and education. And today's session is one of the examples of the type of education work that we do. So if you're interested in learning more about ourselves and our strategic priorities, please do check out our website, and we'll put that link in the chat. And before we delve into the content, I do want to take a bit of time and space to just recognize that talking about hate speech can be very difficult, and it can be a personal topic to many of us. Hearing about hate speech in the way that we're going to talk about it today could bring up some unexpected emotions. So we really do just encourage you, if you need to, please take a step away from your laptop, a step away from the webinar, take a drink of water, do what you need to do to take care of yourself, and make sure that you feel okay and safe during this conversation. We will also insert a few links for resources. So if you do need someone to talk to or are looking for organizations in your area, we are going to put in the link for the BC Mental Health Support Line, the Crisis Center of BC, as well as the Crisis Center of Northern BC, which offers amazing supports for those of us up here in the north. And we are going to be providing the information for the CUAS Crisis Line Society as well, who provide Indigenous specific support services. With that, you will probably notice that our chat function isn't up. Because of the complexity of the topic, we won't be having the chat function open today. Rather, we're encouraging you to use the Q&A. So if you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A function. It just allows us to have some overview over the content and the questions that are being asked, because this is a public space. So we really do want everyone to feel comfortable and empowered to contribute. So please do use the Q&A. We are also really excited to showcase a new Q&A section of our website about hate speech. And we invite you to check this out after the session, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. And please do contact us as you digest this material and as you come up with questions. So our contact information will be available in the info line. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Camilia. While you've been giving that overview, we've been receiving some more responses from people in the Q&A. If you're seeing me look at the corner of my screen, it's because I'm looking down at the Q&A so I can read it. People from all over the province, and also from a variety of identity groups and organizations as well. So thanks for introducing yourselves. So yeah, the flow of how the agenda will work today is we are going to start just after I finish this part about the definition of hate speech. One of our goals is that you as participants learn how hate speech is interpreted by courts and tribunals. So we'll verbally give you an overview of the definition, and then we'll run through some activity questions as well to learn more about that. At that point, we'll move into some real life examples. You might have seen in the email yesterday that we are going to go through some real life examples, some case studies together. At that point, we're really excited to turn to you and hear from you on a section we're calling community care. Another one of our goals is that participants learn things they can do if you see or you experience hate speech. So really excited to hear from you on what resources that you use in your work. So we'll get to that in more detail later on. And we'll close off on the topic of resources, sharing our hate speech resource that Camilia spoke about. So we'll screen share and explain how to access it, how to use it, and hopefully how you can use it in your work and in your lives. So I will pass it to you, Sarah, to do that definition about hate speech. We did ask you to send questions ahead of time when you registered. And a lot of people were wondering about how do you identify hate speech and how is that defined? So hopefully this section helps to answer some of those questions. So over to you, Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily and Camilia. So I'd like to start with the legal elements of hate speech. Both Canada's Criminal Code and BC's Human Rights Code prohibit hate speech. Both laws require that the speech, first of all, targets a person or group of people on the basis of a protected characteristic, like their sexual orientation, religion, disability, or race. Second of all, that the speech is expressed publicly. And third, that it uses language that is an extreme manifestation of hatred because of their protected characteristic, like race or religion, etc. The third factor is usually the hardest to understand and what we will focus on. In legislation that prohibits hate speech, the question is, viewed objectively, would a reasonable person, aware of the context and circumstances, view that expression, the speech, publication, or symbol, for example, as likely to expose a person or persons to detestation and vilification on the basis of a prohibited ground of discrimination?
Sarah, can I ask a question? When you talk about hate speech, does that include written hate speech as well? We had a question from someone who registered on whether stickers would count as hate speech.
Yes, absolutely. Written statements are included. Thanks, Camilia, for that question. We use hate speech only because that's what people usually call it, but the law applies to written as well as spoken statements. So in fact, the form can be many things, including publications or notices, signs, symbols, emblems, photographs, or other representations that amount to hate speech. So yes, depending on the context of that sticker, like for example, what it's communicating, it could be covered.
I see a question here in the Q&A asking about online hate speech. So I'm wondering, Sarah, if you could speak a bit about that as well.
Yes, absolutely. So the criminal code does cover hate speech on the internet, including on social media sites where there is a sufficient link to Canada. Whether or what human rights legislation covers online speech is a more complicated legal question. And if this is something that you're facing, you should, we definitely recommend that you get some legal advice about that. Back over to you, Emily.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Let's continue working through this definition, some of the themes Sarah's been talking about through some Zoom questions, kind of the top 5 things we think you might want to know about hate speech. So we'll work through those together. I did want to acknowledge that we are all joining today's session with a wide range of experiences and knowledge of hate speech. In fact, when you registered, you might have remembered we asked folks how comfortable you are currently identifying hate speech, and we had people all over the board, mostly somewhere in the middle in the somewhat confident range. So no worries if you don't know the answers to the questions. You can, all the answers are anonymous. So if you would like to make a guess, feel free to. If you want to skip a question, totally fine as well. Do whatever feels best for you. We will read out the answers, so we're all learning this together. So let's start with the first question, which is a yes/no question. And the question is, I have heard of BC's Human Rights Code. So you can write yes or no, and then we'll give you some more information about the code after we have some responses here.
They're coming in pretty quick. Already 100 people who answered. That's very quick in 5 seconds. Looks like folks are leaning towards yes. So over to you, Sarah.
Great, thanks. So for those of you who have heard of the code, you may know that the code prohibits hate speech in BC. Did you know that there are actually 2 laws that, that prohibit hate speech in BC? The other law that prohibits hate speech in our province is Canada's Criminal Code.
So when we talk about there being 2 laws that prohibit hate speech in BC, it makes me think about the similarities or differences within those 2, and specifically how those 2 laws are different.
And I'm thinking specifically the legal tests that each law uses to determine whether hate speech is hate speech.
Maybe we can pass to you, Sarah, on that one of whether both these laws use the same legal test.
Yes, actually, the legal test for whether certain speech is hate speech is the same under human rights law and the criminal law.
Great, thanks for clarifying. The next one, the next question here, we're talking about the legal test, makes me think about how hate speech is defined. So I'm curious, maybe we can throw to you as the audience members here again on how you think hate speech is defined. So this one is a true or false question. Some of you already got going on it. The statement is the definition of hate speech is very broad and includes most discriminatory forms of speech. So do you think that's true or false?
Are bringing in their answers. We have about 80 people who answered, and I'm thinking we got some really good questions in the Q&A, sort of about the forms of hate speech and the tests. So I wonder if this will help to answer some of those questions. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. So the answer to this question is actually false. Oops, I keep hitting my hand up button rather than sorry about that.
Zoom, it's a complicated platform.
Complicated for me, at least. So legally, hate speech must be worse than merely offensive. It must be speech that is likely to expose those people who are targeted to detestation and vilification. So that's speech that provokes extreme ill will and goes beyond dislike. So I hope that helps to clarify things a little bit.
What do we mean by detestation and vilification? What does that mean?
Yes, those aren't really commonly used words. So hate speech essentially tries to delegitimize the targeted group as unworthy, useless, or inferior. It is speech that, for example, tries to convince the audience that the group is lawless, dangerous, unworthy, or acceptable. Hate speech can include blaming the group for social problems like crime and disease, comparing them to animals, or accusing them of conspiracies to gain global control. Courts and tribunals call these themes that often appear in hate speech the hallmarks of hate. I hope that helps, provides a little bit more clarification.
That is helpful. Thanks, Sarah. That helps me to kind of get a clearer understanding of what hate speech looks like. And with that, I do want to acknowledge for folks that if the tribunal or the court finds that something is not hate speech, that act or those words still may have harmful impacts to the victims. And we will talk a little bit more about this in our community care section.
Thanks, Camilia, and thanks, Sarah, as well. So we're talking now about situations where the tribunal or court does not find something to be hate speech. So I'm wondering again if we could ask another question to you as the audience, which is, do you think this statement is true or false? If speech does not meet the legal test for hate speech, it may still violate other laws.
Building upon our other section, and looks like we're getting answers in pretty quickly. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Camilia. So the answer is true. Speech that is not illegal under Canada's hate speech laws. Sorry, just trying to get into something here. Maybe this is the problem.
Sometimes when Zoom boxes pop up, you lose it.
Zoom boxes have popped up. So I'm trying to get back into my document and I can't seem to do it right now.
No problem. I think I remember, Sarah, when you've been talking about this before in our practicing for the session, that you were saying that speech that is not illegal under Canada's hate speech laws may still violate other laws, including other sections in the BC Human Rights Code. Is that correct? Am I remembering that correctly?
That's correct. Thank you.
And I'm wondering, while Sarah's pulling that up, are your notes up or?
No, they're not.
Okay. Yeah,
So
maybe
hang
we can
on for a sec.
For sure. We can also provide maybe an example. So what would an example of hate speech, of speech that's not hate speech according to the laws of hate speech, but might violate the law? So an example of speech that might not be hate speech according to the law, but might be the basis for what a workplace discrimination complaint is, where a comment or series of comments, poisonous work environment for an employee of color. It can also be where people make racist jokes, call someone a racist nickname, or make comments about those people, so the othering of people. None of these things together or separately are likely to be hate speech, but may amount to discrimination on the basis of race in employment.
Yes, great, thank you. And I've got my notes back up.
And I just wanted to say that was a question from someone who registered. So I hope that answers your question. Back over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Camilia. Yeah, there was a question about exactly what you're saying, discriminatory speech that's not hate speech. So hope that was helpful, and we'll go into our last question here for this activity. So we've talked about BC's Human Rights Code a few times now. We asked the first question about it. So if someone say they want to make a complaint to BC's Human Rights Tribunal, makes me think about the steps involved. So our true and false question for you is, people cannot make a complaint directly to BC's Human Rights Tribunal about hate speech. They first have to go to they have to report it to the police first. Is that true or false? Looks like answers are coming in quickly for this one as well.
Yeah, super quick. We have about 80 people. This is, I think, a pretty common question, and people striving to learn the differences between the three pillars of BC human rights in the province. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. So the answer is false. If you've been exposed to hate speech in BC, you can file a complaint directly with the Human Rights Tribunal. You do not have to involve the police. Of course, you can if you want to.
What if someone wants to talk to someone before going to the tribunal, not necessarily the police? Are there other organizations that they can contact?
Yes, we certainly acknowledge that you might want to contact someone for support and guidance with this process. For example, people might want to contact a lawyer. BC's Human Rights Clinic, for example, can provide legal advice and representation to people who want to make a complaint to the Human Rights Tribunal.
So that moves us on to our next session. So we are going to be exploring a few real life stories from the tribunal in this section. By looking at these real life stories, we'll be able to explain and help to understand hate speech. So both Emily and I are going to provide a brief summary of cases from the tribunal, and Sarah will then provide us with a more detailed explanation on hate speech. And before we enter into this, I do want to just remind folks that we are talking about real life cases. So please, if you do need to take a step away from the computer to take care of yourself, please do so. Please take care of yourself during this session. And we also will let you know the type of hate speech that's being discussed before we read out the case study, just so folks are prepared. So I'll move forward with case one. And in this case, this case study deals with anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism. So someone spray painted messages on various buildings associated with Muslims and Jews. The graffiti included symbols, violent racial slurs, and numbers linked to white supremacist groups. Sarah, can you tell us a bit more about this case?
I can, and this is a good example of now we're getting into some of the pretty awful stuff that happens around hate speech, and so it's difficult stuff, difficult content. The graffiti in that case publicly targeted groups and locations based on their religion, Islam and Judaism. The speech in this case included symbols and slurs that are well known to be associated with anti-Semitic and Islamophobic movements. The graffiti urged violence against those targeted, and this was likely to expose those groups to hatred and contempt. So I hope that also helps to explain things a bit, Camilia. It provides an example of, a pretty awful situation.
Thank you for that, Sarah. So move to case 2, and in this case, we're dealing with anti-Semitism. So I'll read it out. A high school teacher gave lessons and lectures to his students and denied historical facts that related to the Holocaust and used negative words and concepts to describe Jewish people.
So here, by including in his lectures statements denying the Holocaust and attributing evil characteristics to Jewish people, the teacher made public statements that were likely to expose Jewish people to hatred and contempt.
Thank you, Sarah and Camilia, for those 2 case study overviews. We're going to move now to the 3rd and final case study. And this one is a case study of Morgane Auger versus William Wadcott. And this case study does deal with transphobia. So we wanted to let you know about that before we jump into it. So for this case study, we're going to go into more detail of the first 2. I'm going to read out some of the key facts about the case. And then afterwards, we're going to launch another Zoom poll to ask if you think that it constitutes hate speech, or whether you think the tribunal found it to be hate speech. And then we'll pass it over to you again, Sarah, to talk us through that a little bit more.
Okay, great,
So,
thanks.
Let's start with the details. Morgane Auger is running in a provincial election. She is transgender. William Wadcott creates and distributes a flyer about Morgane. Among other things, the flyer says Morgane is promoting a false narrative that she is a woman, so in other words, denies transgender people exist. It associates transgender people with social problems and disease. It tries to delegitimize transgender people by suggesting that they are liars and untrustworthy. It uses his interpretation, so this is William's interpretation of the Bible and human biology to make his views seem credible. It advocates against voting for her because she is transgender and therefore, he says, unworthy to hold office. So Morgane files a complaint with the tribunal saying the flyer is likely to expose her and transgender people to hatred or contempt. And finally, one more point should show up on your screen here, which is that William says he is a Christian and has the right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So we're going to keep that slide up and we're going to launch the Zoom activity. And the question is going to ask you what you think the tribunal found. There we go. There's on your screen now. So do you think the tribunal found that the flyer was hate speech? Yes, it was hate speech, or no, it was not hate speech. And we'll go into the details again after we hear from you.
Like folks are answering pretty quickly and just bringing ourselves back to the descriptions and definitions Sarah gave before might help us to answer this one. So Sarah, was this hate speech?
Yes, it looks like people guessed that correctly too. The tribunal did find that the flyer was hate speech. The tribunal found that a reasonable person aware of the context and circumstances would conclude that the contents of the flyer were likely to expose transgender people to hatred or contempt. So again, remembering that hatred and contempt means the high bar we discussed earlier, detestation and vilification.
Sarah, I understand that this was an especially important case in helping us all understand hate speech. Why was that?
This was a really important case. So this was the first case in front of a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal involving allegations of hate speech on the basis of gender identity In other words, targeting a transgender person or the trans community with hate speech. So that's why it was a very important case.
I have a question as well, Sarah. I'm wondering, when the tribunal went to make their decision, what are some of the things that they recognized as the relevant context and circumstances to lead to their decision?
The tribunal's decision in this case was very detailed, and some of the things that the tribunal talked about included the pervasive discrimination against transgender people and the barriers that they face to participate in political life. And unlike other groups protected by the Human Rights Code, transgender people often find their very existence the subject of public debate and condemnation.
And seeing in the Q&A, we have a couple questions around freedom of expression and religion. So for this case, how did the tribunal respond in terms of William's freedom of expression and religion?
Both of the tribunal found that both of these freedom of expression and freedom of religion are fundamental rights enshrined in Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A decision finding that William breached the code would infringe his rights, and the tribunal was required to consider that infringement in determining Morgan's complaint. So in terms of freedom of religion, the tribunal found that the infringement would be relatively minor. He remains free to hold his religious beliefs and communicate them privately. He is only prohibited from practicing his religion in a way that violates the human rights of other people. So that's on the freedom of religion side of things. In terms of freedom of expression, the tribunal followed Supreme Court of Canada guidance on the scope of freedom of expression and the values it protects, including fostering Canada's democracy, enabling the search for truth, and nourishing self-fulfillment. The harm caused by hate speech undermines rather than promotes the values underpinning freedom of expression, as well as the values of equality and multiculturalism that are also contained in the Charter. So simply put, the tribunal found that if speech meets the test for hate speech, then infringing someone's freedom of expression is justified. And I'll pass it back over to you now, both of you.
Thanks, Sarah. I wanted to just thank you so much for the extra detail on that last point. We have a couple of responses in the Q&A here that really appreciated you for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And that's bringing us into the next portion of our presentation. So before we start, as mentioned earlier in the session, we recognize that discriminatory incidents that might not meet the legal definition of hate speech can still have equally long-lasting impacts on communities and individuals. And those impacts can vary. They can be physical, they can be social, emotional, and also mental health impacts. If someone's going through a traumatic event or has gone through a traumatic event, they can go through a range of emotions, including fear, anger, sadness. And we recognize that many of you here in the space, about 130 of you, have often supported folks who have been impacted by hate speech or other traumatic events. And that could be within your respective professions or within your personal life. So we wanted to take an opportunity today to highlight some resources that you can rely on to assist folks through difficult times. So in this section called Community Care, we're looking forward to amplifying your work towards preventing discrimination, discriminatory incidents, and supporting communities or individuals experiencing discrimination.
Yeah, we're really quite excited to hear from you during this part and read through some of your responses. So what we would really love to hear from you about is who or where you might direct someone who came to you for support. So for example, if we think about the case study we just went into detail of with Morgane Auger, if someone in Morgane's situation or anyone in a similar kind of situation came to you for a support system, so you can imagine maybe it's a friend or a colleague or someone accessing an organization for support, wondering what resources you would suggest to them. So we would really appreciate if you could put some of your answers into the Q&A as you've been adding to throughout the session. And Camilia and I will read out some themes we're seeing and maybe pull out a couple of specific resources as well. While you're thinking about it, maybe consider which kinds of supports you would provide depending on the conversation as well. So in some cases, for example, you might turn to filing a complaint resource or other kinds of online or other kinds of resources. In other settings, you might provide other kinds, like maybe more emotional support. So maybe think about that frame as well as you're putting in your recommendations and resources.
It can vary so much depending on the conversation that you're having with the individual. And we have folks joining from all over the province. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about the resources in your community and the organizations that you would recommend to folks. So while folks are thinking and we're keeping an eye on the Q&A, we thought we'd highlight a few resources that we have come across. As I've mentioned a couple times, I'm calling from Kitley territory, so that's up in Prince George. So I did want to highlight some resources that are here in the north. So the first one being the Skeena Diversity Society. So this is located in Terrace, BC, which is just west of Prince George. And they are part of Resilience BC's anti-racism network, and they provide a variety of services to the community, including settlement support and community events. So a really great resource for folks in that area. I also want to highlight Nenke Nezelne. So this is a program offered through Carrier Sekani Family Services here in Prince George. And they focus on the intersectionality of LGBTQ2+ and Indigenous identities. And they provide health and wellness supports for folks in this area and folks from those communities. So I'm just seeing some. I see the Kettle for mental health support. I haven't heard of them. I'll have to do a little bit of digging. Lots of really good stuff going in here. Oh, legal advice from a lawyer. That's a really important one as well, depending on who you're talking to and what sort of support that they're looking for.
Yeah, we're seeing some kind of general themes, like there's a couple of mental health supports. There's, as you said, individual lawyers you might be able to contact. I'm also seeing some recommendations here related to certain identity groups. So there's the Catherine White Holman Wellness Center. I just want to make sure I get the name right, who offers counseling support for trans folks. So specific groups or resources might work really well for specific identity groups as well.
Mentions of Resilience BC. They have a huge anti-racism network all over the province with spokes everywhere. So please do check out some of their spokes in your regions. They have lots of wonderful supports and organizations.
So in addition to the organizations we're seeing here, we also want to talk about different kinds of supports like training or education opportunities. So for example, we've heard about some really great bystander and intervention type training. So this kind of bystander training, as many of you may be familiar with, provides training on how people can safely assess a situation and voice an opinion about someone else's language or their behavior that might be inappropriate or hurtful or abusive or dangerous. So that those trainings are offered by various organizations throughout the province. A couple I'll just highlight here. We know that Success offers these trainings, as well as you can take a look online for Hollaback. They also offer free online training sessions as well.
I think we've mentioned, and I'm seeing in the chat as well, hotline services. In the chat, we'll put a link to our inquiry website where we provide the names and contact information for various hotline services. I think also sometimes we don't think about fact sheets when you're having a conversation with someone, and it can be nice to take something home. So educational fact sheets, which are offered by one I can think of through Transcare BC, which is a provincial organization offering resources and supports for the trans community. So often educational fact sheets can be really helpful as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess in combination with that, Sometimes organizations and communities have created reporting systems as well to be able to track these kinds of incidents. And quite often those kinds of reporting systems are a really empowering resource for folks to be able to report incidents. And then that information quite often leads to educational fact sheets or community sessions or ways to work through those kinds of situations. So a wide variety of different kinds of resources that are available.
Absolutely, that's so important. And reporting systems can be formal and they can be informal as well. So looking at the social capacity of your area and what the best areas are, or what the best linkages to that are. Lots of great stuff in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Before we close out this session, I do want to talk a little bit about, as important as resources and organizations and training are, we all know that it's equally important to celebrate and to promote joy and have safer spaces for people to come together. And I'm sure often as you're talking to someone, sometimes the conversation leads you to talking about where is a safe space that I can celebrate myself, I can be a self-advocate. So we wanted to close this session and with providing some examples of that. And please do in the chat if you have organizations or events in your area that can be helpful to folks. Please do put that in the Q&A. I keep saying chat, my apologies. But the one that we want to highlight first is Celebrate Diverse Abilities, which is a magazine through Community Living BC. And it showcases and celebrates self-advocates and events and celebrates diverse abilities. The Winter 2021 edition is out and the theme is resilience. So do check out their website to take a look at that magazine. And speaking of events and spaces, we did want to bring those who live in the Vancouver area, highlight Community. So this is a nonprofit organization that's based in Vancouver, and their work is to improve queer, trans, and two-spirit lives. We particularly wanted to highlight their community calendar. So if you look at their website, they have a calendar that outlines different events throughout the month, support groups, or just opportunities to come together and share and celebrate and be together in a safer space.
Thanks, Camilia. Yeah, I really appreciate the addition of the celebration and the importance of celebration. These topics, like you said, throughout the whole session can feel quite heavy. So taking the time to celebrate when possible and when that feels good is really important. So thanks for highlighting that. This is our opportunity now, as we're talking about resources and things that are out in the world, to talk about our resource, our hate speech resource that we're really excited to officially launch with all of you today. I'm very excited, if you can't tell, to launch this resource and pass it to Sarah in a second here to walk you through it, because I know that individuals and organizations have been asking for more information about hate speech in BC for a really long time. So I'm really excited to share this with you and hope that it's really helpful to answer some of the questions you might have been having about hate speech in BC.
Thanks, Emily. If I could take a moment, I know Emily said we're very excited. We also just wanted to pass our appreciation on to the office's staff, everyone's hard work over the last long while, pulling together this resource. Thank you to them, but also thank you to all the communities and organizations and individuals who've helped to review the Q&A, who've provided updates and additions and improved it to get it to this point where we're happy to launch it to the public. So thank you to everyone so much who contributed.
And I was just, as we were looking at the resources in the Q&A, I was noticing people had some outstanding questions as well about hate speech, and having gone through the resource, I think that the resource should be able to answer a lot of those questions. So we'll pull out a few items and then encourage you to spend some time with it as well, and they may be able to answer the questions you have. So over to you, Sarah. Great,
thank you, Emily and Camilia. So here you can see on the screen is the hate speech Q&A that we've created. We created this resource because it seemed that many people did not know that the Human Rights Code prohibited hate speech. All the focus seemed to be more on the criminal law system, including the police response. We wanted people to have a resource to explain hate speech laws under the Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code, and also to explain a bit about the legal processes involved in each system. We also wanted to provide a list of support resources for people who are affected by hate speech. As you can see there, you can find the resource on our website at bchumanrights.ca hate speech Q&A. I'd like to take you through some of the main sections of the resource to give you a sense of how we've organized it. So you can see at the top, we've got the title being Hate Speech and the Law in British Columbia. And as we scroll down, we've got some sections that talk about what is hate speech, what is discriminatory speech. And of course, if you click on each section, that will expand and give the description or the answers to those questions. We have a section there about offensive speech versus hate speech and discriminatory speech, the characteristics that are protected in the Criminal Code and the Human Rights Code. And then one section I'd like to highlight and take you through a little bit is the section called Which Laws Prohibit Hate Speech? What do they say? And so you can see in this section, we give a bit more description about the laws that cover hate speech. We've covered this in the session today. And in this section, you'll see if you scroll down, there's a summary of differences between hate speech under the Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code. And this is where we've tried to create a fairly easy to access, hopefully at least easy to read table summarizing some of the main similarities and differences. So in this section, for example, we start with the prohibitions against hate speech, and we talk about the differences between the Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code. We also have a section, process for filing a complaint. So under the Human Rights Code, the process is to go through the Human Rights Tribunal, whereas generally the process for the Criminal Code is that victims file complaints with the police, and it goes through that process, the criminal law system. We've got more details there about the personal characteristics that are protected, the decision makers involved, the standard of proof, and the consequences. So that's that section. We then go on to talk more about how is someone convicted of the different offenses involving hate speech under the Criminal Code, and we talk about the types of speech that are covered by hate speech, and a section on online hate speech, the distinctions with the interaction with hate speech and Canadians' right to freedom of speech. And then a section I wanted to highlight here as well is what can I do if I'm a victim of hate speech? So here we go into more details about the processes involved under both the Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code. And we talk about seeking assistance, documenting the incident and what happened, what you might do if you experience discriminatory or hate speech in your workplace, filing a human rights complaint, and more details about the process for doing that, and legal assistance you might be able to get, as we mentioned earlier, through the Human Rights Clinic. And then we also talk about the process of reporting to police. So, and the ways to contact the police. We have the emergency and the non-emergency lines there, and how to get support during the criminal law process as well. And we then go on and talk about specialized support for Indigenous people. And then at the end of the resource, so back to the other questions that we answer in the FAQ, we end off with what can I do if I witness hate speech, and what are some other ways to fight hate. So if you have questions about this resource, you of course are welcome to contact us at info@humanrights.ca. info@bchumanrights.ca, or we have our phone number, which we'll put into the so that we'll make it accessible to you. But I just wanted to stress that we're unable to provide legal advice about particular cases. So we won't be able to comment on particular cases, and we certainly hope that our resource is helpful in answering hopefully most of the questions that you might have. So that's a summary of our resource, and I will pass it back over to you, Camilia.
I really appreciate how that resource is organized, because yes, it provides support and options for folks who are dealing with hate speech, but it also provides folks with resources and steps to take if they're dealing with a situation that doesn't meet hate speech under the law. So one that sticks out in my mind is the step of making sure you're recording a discriminatory incident. It's so important that this is spelled out that way, because one, we know that these incidents can be very traumatic, even if they don't meet hate speech under the law. And when something traumatic happens to us, sometimes it takes us a while to let it sink in and to work through what it means. So we may not know that something has met the legal definition of hate speech right away, and we might need to reach out to resources, and knowing that there are opportunities and resources and steps that you can take if something traumatic has happened to you will help us all move towards a place where we feel empowered to take action and to do something if we've been involved or the victim of hate speech or another traumatic event.
Thanks for that reminder, Camilia, and thanks for walking us through the resource, Sarah. You might have noticed for you in the audience, as Sarah was going through, there's also quite a lot of links in the resource as well. So if you do have time and want to do a bit of a deeper dive, we link to other organizations and other resources available to give even more information. So hopefully you can take some time and review that when it works for you. We're nearing the end of our time together today. So what I would like to do at this point is launch an in-session, a few questions for you. So it should show up on your screen in a second here. One of the questions is going to be, how confident do you feel now recognizing hate speech, now that we've spent about an hour together talking about it in a bit more detail? The second question, which will pop, there we go. The second question is, was the session useful for you or for me as you're answering it? And the last question is, how likely are you to use our hate speech Q&A that we just sent over? And while you're filling that out, I wanted to give a bit more information about something else that's exciting that's happening here at the office, which is that you may have heard that the commissioner recently announced that she is conducting her first inquiry in this role. And that inquiry is into hate incidents during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this topic of the inquiry arose out of the significant increase of reported hate-related incidents, including online incidents since the start of the pandemic in early 2020, specifically in BC. So we're really excited to share how today's session fits in within the inquiry. The webpage, which I think was just posted into the chat there, has more information about the inquiry, including the terms of reference. And the terms of reference includes the definition of how we're defining hate incidents and the scope of the inquiry. So as we talked about, today's session was specifically on hate speech as it's legally defined. And again, the inquiry has its own definition for hate incidents that's not a legal definition. So you can review the terms of reference to learn more about the inquiry. You might be interested to know that hate speech does show up a couple of times in the inquiry. One is that we are what is in scope is examining online hate speech and provincial regulation of content of that speech, and also to consider the application of hate speech law in the BC's Human Rights Code. So you'll see that in what is in scope if you wanted to learn more. And we do encourage you to follow our website, follow our social media. There will be opportunities for you to be involved in this really important inquiry. So I hope that you are able to follow along and get involved when that opens up. Back to you, Camilia, for some other closing notes here.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. We've gone through a lot in an hour, and I want to recognize that. That was a lot of content. We spent the first bit of our session, and Sarah walked us through what is hate speech, how is it interpreted by the various courts, what's the test of hate speech, and we also learned some language around that. So the ideas of detestation and vilification. So we spent a lot of time going into both the legal terms of hate speech, but also what it means like in the world. We looked at some case studies to see how not only what situations some folks have felt, but how that's been interpreted by the court. We also spent some time both in the community care section, but also by going through our resources on our website. What are some things folks can do? One, if they're experiencing hate speech, some resources and some organizations that you may connect with. And also what to do if you may have witnessed hate speech. So those are things like the community reporting we were talking about, or other mechanisms that you feel comfortable going forward with to report incidents of hate speech or other traumatic events. And we've also let you know how to contact us. So through the Q&A, we've done our best to answer the questions that you've had. But if you do have any more questions on hate speech, please do connect with us. All our contact information is on the website, and we'll provide it at the end of the session as well. And you can find out more about the different projects and priorities that we're focusing on right now through our website, especially our hate speech Q&A, which we're so excited is on there.
And on the topic of resources and such, Camilia, reminds me that our inquiry website, if you do have a chance to review it, has a page specifically about supports and resources, lots of hotlines and those kinds of support. So in the list of resources that you might find helpful for your communities, you might want to review that web page as well and see if there's something there that works for you. I did want to let you know that when you go to close the Zoom poll, a link will pop up to a few evaluation questions. And if you do have time to spend a couple of minutes reviewing and telling us about your experiences today, that is incredibly valuable for us. We look forward to doing this kind of session in the future. So any feedback you have, we really do our best to try and incorporate it and create the best sessions we can for all of you. So would really appreciate you taking the time to do that. Anything you wanted to add in closing here, Camilia, as we end off?
No, just thank you all so much for your time and your thoughtful questions. Just thank you so much for joining us, and please do, like we said, if you have other questions or want to get in contact with us, please do reach out.
Is there any closing remarks from you as well?
Just wanted to thank everyone for participating. I hope it was useful, and I hope you find the materials on our website to be useful. And thanks everyone for all of your suggestions about other resources that can be helpful for people when dealing with hate speech. And yeah, so thank you very much.
Yeah, and I will echo what Sarah and Camilia said. So much appreciation for all of you. I'm thinking a lot about space and what it feels like to be in a space, and having this kind of virtual event feels a little bit different than if we are in a physical space together, but that it doesn't negate the amount of appreciation and the amount of care we're sharing in this space together. So thank you for taking the time on a Wednesday afternoon to spend it with us talking about hate speech, and we hope you have a great afternoon and evening. Looking forward to connecting again soon. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.